What if I told you that everything you think you know about Samson is wrong? What if the story of the biblical strongman, the one reduced to a mere cautionary tale about the dangers of women and temptation, was far more complex, far more relevant to your life than you ever imagined? My name is Jameson Hayes, and I've spent years delving into ancient texts, not just reading the words on the page, but searching for the beating heart beneath them. And what I've discovered about Samson has shaken me to my core. This isn't just a story about a man with superhuman strength. It's a story about the human condition itself, our capacity for both great love and terrible betrayal, for earth-shattering power and crippling weakness. We're going to throw out the Sunday school cliches, the simplistic interpretations, and dive deep into the soul of a man who was both a hero and a villain, a savior and a sinner. We're going to explore the hidden meanings behind the legends, the psychological battles that raged within Samson long before he ever faced the Philistines. Why should you care? Because Samson's struggles are your struggles. His temptations are your temptations. His journey to redemption is a roadmap for anyone who has ever felt lost, broken, or trapped by their own choices. This isn't just about understanding an ancient story. It's about understanding yourself. In this story, we're going to unearth the untold story of Samson. We're going to challenge conventional wisdom, explore controversial theories, and uncover the hidden truths that have been buried for centuries. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll never see Samson the same way again. You might even see yourself differently. So buckle up. This is going to be a wild ride. We're going to journey into the heart of darkness and emerge with a new understanding of strength, faith, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Are you ready to discover the real Samson? Then let's begin. The burden of prophecy. Samson's story traditionally begins with a miraculous birth. His mother, a woman from the tribe of Dan, was barren, a condition often viewed as a curse in her time. She and her husband, Manoah, lived under the oppressive rule of the Philistines, a powerful and technologically advanced people who had subjugated the Israelites for 40 long years. The weight of this oppression, coupled with the personal sorrow of childlessness, must have created a heavy atmosphere in their home. One can imagine the quiet desperation, the whispered prayers for deliverance, both from the Philistines and from the stigma of barrenness. Then one ordinary day, the extraordinary happened. An angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife, a divine messenger bringing a promise that would change their lives and the destiny of their people forever. She would conceive and bear a son who would be set apart for a special purpose, to begin the deliverance of Israel from the hand of the Philistines. This was no ordinary pregnancy. The angel gave specific instructions. The child was to be a Nazirite from the womb, dedicated to God. This meant adhering to a strict set of rules, including abstaining from wine and any fermented drink, and most significantly, never cutting his hair. This last injunction, the uncut hair, would become the physical symbol of Samson's consecration, and as we shall see, the key to his legendary strength. Now let's pause for a moment and consider the psychological impact of this prophecy on the young Samson. Imagine growing up knowing you were different, that you carried a divine mandate, a destiny far greater than yourself. How would that shape a child's psyche? We can speculate that it might have created a sense of isolation. Did Samson feel like an outsider, even among his own people? Did he struggle to form normal relationships, knowing that he was set apart, that his life was not entirely his own? Perhaps there were moments of youthful rebellion, a testing of the boundaries of his unique existence. Did he ever resent the restrictions placed upon him? Did he yearn for a life free from the weight of prophecy? We can imagine a young Samson gazing at other children playing freely, unburdened by destiny, and wondering what it would be like to be just like them. Maybe he confided his doubts and fears to his parents, who, despite their unwavering faith, might have struggled to provide answers to the unanswerable questions of a child chosen by God. The weight of expectation must have been immense. Every childish feat of strength, every display of unusual ability would have been seen as a sign, a confirmation of the angel's prophecy. Did this create a sense of pressure? Did Samson feel like he had to constantly prove himself? to live up to the expectations of his parents, his community, and perhaps even God himself? The seeds of rebellion, his parents, Manoah and his wife, whose name is not mentioned in the Bible, were undoubtedly devout, filled with awe and trepidation at the divine pronouncements. They meticulously followed the angel's instructions, raising Samson according to the Nazirite vow. They taught him about his heritage, the stories of the Israelite ancestors, their triumphs and failures, and the enduring covenant with God. They instilled in him the importance of his mission, the liberation of his people from Philistine oppression. But they were also human and likely grappled with their own anxieties. How do you raise a child chosen by God? How do you prepare him for a destiny filled with both glory and danger? They must have watched him with a mixture of pride and apprehension, marveling at his growing strength while fearing the challenges that lay ahead. Did they worry about his fiery spirit, his independent nature? Did they sense the inner turmoil that might have been brewing beneath the surface? We can imagine them sharing their concerns in hushed tones, late at night after Samson was asleep. Did they ever question their own ability to guide him? Did they pray for wisdom, for strength, for the ability to protect their extraordinary son from the dangers of the world, and perhaps from himself? As Samson grew, his strength became legendary, a source of both wonder and fear. There are stories, little anecdotes passed down through generations that hinted at the power he would come to possess. Imagine a young Samson effortlessly lifting objects that grown men struggled with. Picture the awestruck faces of the villagers, the whispers spreading about the boy who was clearly different, special. One such story, perhaps embellished over time but nonetheless illustrative, tells of a young Samson encountering a lion in the vineyards near Timnah. This wasn't just any lion, it was a young, fierce beast, a predator in its prime. Any ordinary person would have fled in terror, but not Samson. Filled with a surge of divine power, he seized the lion and with his bare hands tore it apart as if it were a mere young goat. Let's pause here for a moment and truly appreciate the magnitude of this feat. Imagine encountering a lion in the wild, unarmed. The sheer terror, the adrenaline surge, the fight-or-flight response. Most of us would freeze or flee, but Samson, empowered by his divine strength, faced the lion head-on and overpowered it. This wasn't just a display of physical prowess. It was a symbolic victory, a foreshadowing of his future triumphs over the Philistines. The lion, a symbol of untamed power, was no match for the divinely infused strength of Samson. News of this incredible act spread like wildfire through the Israelite settlements. The people, long accustomed to Philistine dominance, began to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, deliverance was at hand. Samson, the boy with the miraculous birth, the young man who could kill a lion with his bare hands, might be the one the angel had foretold. Hope, a fragile but potent force, began to flicker in the hearts of the oppressed Israelites. But what about the psychological toll of these feats? Did Samson ever fear his own power? Did he worry about losing control? We can imagine him after the adrenaline subsided, looking at his hands stained with the lion's blood and wondering at the source of this incredible, terrifying strength. Did he question whether he was worthy of it? Did he fear the destructive potential within him? And what about the constant threat of violence that now loomed over him? Each display of his strength, each victory, however small, further enraged the Philistines. They saw him as a growing threat, a symbol of resistance that needed to be eliminated. Samson, in turn, had to be constantly vigilant, knowing that any lapse in judgment could be fatal. He was no longer just a young man. He was a target, a symbol, a weapon in a war he hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. This constant tension, this back and forth between victory and danger, is what makes Samson's story so gripping. It's a constant reminder that even the strongest among us are not invincible. And as we'll see, Samson's greatest challenges were not on the battlefield, but in the realm of his own heart, his own desires. The seeds of rebellion, perhaps sown in his youth, were beginning to sprout. The very strength that made him a hero also made him vulnerable, a target not just for the Philistines, but for the temptations that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The siren song of forbidden love. Samson, for all his divinely ordained strength and his mission to liberate his people, was also a man of intense passions. And it was these passions, specifically his attraction to Philistine women, that would prove to be his Achilles heel, the fatal flaw that nearly destroyed him. This is where the story takes a darker, more complex turn, moving beyond the simplistic narrative of good versus evil and delving into the murky depths of human desire and its consequences. His first recorded infatuation was with a Philistine woman from Timnah, the very same region where he had slain the lion. This choice was not merely a personal one, it was a transgression, a violation of the societal and religious norms of his people. The Israelites, especially after years of Philistine oppression, viewed such unions with deep suspicion and disapproval. Marriage outside the community was not just frowned upon, it was seen as a betrayal, a weakening of the already fragile bonds that held the Israelites together. His parents, Manoah and his wife, were understandably distraught. They pleaded with him, their voices filled with a mixture of parental concern and religious anxiety. "Isn't there a woman among your relatives or among all our people?" they implored. "Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" Their words echoed the sentiments of their community, the deep-seated fear of assimilation, of losing their identity under the weight of foreign influence. But Samson, blinded by infatuation, perhaps even driven by a subconscious desire to rebel against the constraints of his destiny, was unmoved. "Get her for me," he insisted. "She's the right one for me." His words were not just a statement of preference, they were a declaration of independence, a rejection of the expectations placed upon him. He was determined to follow his heart, or perhaps more accurately, his desires, no matter the consequences. Here we see the fascinating and tragic interplay between free will and destiny in Samson's life. Was he simply a puppet of fate, playing out a predetermined role? Or did he have agency, the ability to make choices that shaped his own path? The story suggests a complex middle ground. While Samson was undoubtedly chosen for a specific purpose, he was also given the freedom to make his own decisions, even if those decisions led him astray. I can relate to this on some level. Haven't we all, at some point, felt the pull of a forbidden attraction, the allure of something we know is wrong but can't seem to resist? Haven't we all made decisions based on fleeting emotions, only to regret them later? Samson's struggle is a universal one, a reminder that even the strongest among us are susceptible to the siren song of temptation. Samson's decision to marry the woman from Timnah set in motion a chain of events that would have devastating consequences. During the week-long wedding feast, a customary celebration in that era, Samson, in a display of his characteristic bravado and perhaps a touch of arrogance, posed a riddle to the 30 Philistine men who attended as his companions. The riddle was based on his earlier encounter with the lion and the honey he later found in its carcass. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. This seemingly innocuous act was, in reality, a dangerous game. It was a test of wit, yes, but it was also a display of power, a subtle reminder to the Philistines that Samson was not to be trifled with. The stakes were high. 30 sets of clothing, a significant sum in those days. The Philistine guests, unable to solve the riddle and facing a substantial loss, resorted to underhanded tactics. They threatened Samson's new wife, pressuring her to betray her husband and reveal the answer. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us," they demanded, "or we will burn you and your father's household to death." This is where the story takes a particularly tragic turn. Samson's wife, caught between her loyalty to her husband and the very real threat to her life and the lives of her family, made a fateful decision. She chose self-preservation over marital fidelity. She wept and pleaded with Samson, using emotional manipulation to wear him down. "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me?" she cried. "This is the third time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." Driven by a desire to protect her family and perhaps manipulated by her own fear and desperation, she betrayed him, revealing the answer to the riddle. Samson, enraged by this betrayal, his pride wounded and his sense of justice violated, fulfilled his part of the wager in a brutal fashion. He went down to Ashkelon, another Philistine city, and killed 30 of their men, taking their garments to pay his debt. This act of violence, though seemingly justified within the context of the wager, further escalated the conflict between Samson and the Philistines, setting in motion a cycle of revenge and retribution that would have far-reaching consequences. The woman from Timnah, caught in the crossfire of this escalating conflict, was ultimately given to another man, one of Samson's wedding companions. This act, a final insult to Samson, ignited a fury within him that would lead to even greater destruction. But even this betrayal wasn't enough to deter Samson from his dangerous passions. He later fell in love with another Philistine woman, Delilah. This relationship would prove to be his ultimate undoing. The web of deception. The story of Samson and Delilah is perhaps the most famous and most misunderstood part of the entire saga. It's often presented as a simple tale of female treachery, with Delilah as the archetypal femme fatale, the seductive temptress who brings down the mighty hero. But a closer examination reveals a much more complex and nuanced narrative, one that raises questions about the nature of love, trust, manipulation, and the corrupting influence of power. Delilah, whose name has become synonymous with betrayal, was a woman living in the valley of Sorek, a region known for its vineyards and, significantly, located on the border between Philistine and Israelite territory. This geographical detail is important, as it places Delilah in a liminal space, a zone of cultural and political tension. She was likely a Philistine, though some scholars have speculated she might have been an Israelite living under Philistine rule. Regardless of her precise origin, she was a woman caught in the middle of a conflict much larger than herself. The Philistine rulers, having witnessed Samson's devastating power firsthand and recognizing the threat he posed to their dominance, saw in Delilah an opportunity. They approached her with a proposition, a bribe that was both tempting and terrifying. See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. 1,100 shekels from each of the 5 Philistine rulers was an enormous sum, equivalent to a fortune in those days. It was enough to tempt anyone, especially someone living in a war-torn region where survival was often precarious. But it wasn't just the money. There was also likely an element of coercion, an unspoken threat that hung in the air. The Philistine rulers were not known for their kindness, and Delilah would have understood the consequences of refusing their offer. Now let's delve deeper into the complexities of this relationship. Delilah wasn't just a beautiful woman. She was a master manipulator. She used all her charm and wiles to try to get Samson to reveal his secret. She pestered him day and night, using his love for her as a weapon against him. Samson, blinded by his affection for Delilah, initially resisted her attempts. He gave her false answers, leading the Philistines on wild goose chases. But Delilah was persistent. She wore him down, using emotional manipulation and accusations of mistrust to break his resolve. She kept asking him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." But was Delilah merely a cold-hearted seductress, driven solely by greed? Or were her motivations more complex? Was she perhaps a victim of circumstance, caught between her desire for security, or even survival, and a growing affection for the man she was being paid to betray? Some scholars suggest that Delilah might have been genuinely torn. Perhaps she initially saw Samson as a means to an end, a way to secure her future in a volatile world. But as she spent time with him, as she witnessed his strength but also his vulnerability, his humor, and his passion, she might have developed genuine feelings for him. This internal conflict would have made her task even more agonizing, turning her every act of seduction into a painful betrayal, not just of Samson, but of her own heart. We can imagine her wrestling with her conscience, torn between the tempting reward offered by the Philistines and the growing unease in her soul. Did she try to justify her actions, telling herself that Samson was a danger to her people, that he deserved to be brought down? Or did she simply try to numb herself to the emotional consequences of her actions, focusing on the material gain that would secure her future? The text itself offers tantalizing hints of Delilah's inner turmoil. Her repeated pleas to Samson, her accusations of his lack of trust, might not have been mere manipulations. They could also be interpreted as expressions of genuine frustration, a desperate attempt to understand the man she was falling for, even as she was betraying him. Perhaps she hoped on some level that he would confide in her, not just revealing the secret of his strength, but also opening up to her emotionally, creating a genuine bond that might somehow absolve her of her guilt. And what about Samson? Was he simply a naive fool, blinded by lust and easily manipulated by a beautiful woman? Or was there something more complex at play in his interactions with Delilah? It's important to remember that Samson was no ordinary man. He was a warrior, a leader, a man who had lived his entire life under the shadow of a divine prophecy. He was accustomed to being on guard, to being wary of his enemies. It seems unlikely that he would have been completely oblivious to Delilah's true intentions. Perhaps on some level, Samson knew he was being played. Perhaps he even suspected Delilah's motives. But he was also a man of deep passions, a man who craved connection, who longed for intimacy. His previous relationships with Philistine women had ended in betrayal and violence, leaving him emotionally scarred and perhaps, subconsciously, seeking a different outcome. One could argue that Samson, in his interactions with Delilah, was engaging in a dangerous game of his own. He was testing her, pushing her, seeing how far she would go. Each time he gave her a false answer about the source of his strength, he was, in a sense, offering her a chance to prove her loyalty, to choose him over the tempting reward offered by the Philistines. But it was a test he was destined to fail. Because ultimately, Samson's desire for connection, his yearning for a love that wouldn't betray him, blinded him to the reality of his situation. He wanted to believe in Delilah, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. He wanted to believe that he could finally have a relationship that wasn't tainted by the conflict between his people and the Philistines. His need for love and acceptance made him vulnerable. Finally, after much prodding, worn down by Delilah's relentless emotional pressure, and perhaps by his own inner turmoil, Samson gave in. He revealed to her the truth that he had kept hidden for so long, the secret that was both the source of his strength and the symbol of his sacred vow, his hair. He told her, "No razor has ever been used on my head because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." This was the moment of Samson's ultimate betrayal. The woman he loved, the woman he had, perhaps foolishly, trusted, had used his love against him. She had manipulated him into revealing his greatest vulnerability, and the consequences were immediate and devastating. While Samson slept, Delilah, whether driven by greed, fear, or a complex mix of both, called for a Philistine to shave off his 7 braids of hair. As his hair, the symbol of his Nazirite vow and the source of his God-given strength, fell to the floor, Samson's power vanished. He awoke, not to the loving embrace of Delilah, but to the harsh reality of his capture. The Philistines, overjoyed at finally subduing their most formidable enemy, did not hesitate to inflict upon him the cruelest of punishments. They gouged out his eyes, blinding the man who had once been a beacon of hope for the Israelites. They bound him with bronze shackles and took him to Gaza, one of their major cities, where he was set to grinding grain in the prison, a task usually reserved for animals or the lowest of slaves. This was the ultimate humiliation for Samson. The man who had once been a symbol of strength, a warrior who had single-handedly defeated Philistine armies, was now reduced to a blind, broken prisoner, a mere shadow of his former self. Each turn of the heavy millstone was a stark reminder of his fall from grace, a constant, agonizing symbol of his lost power, his lost freedom, and the devastating consequences of his misplaced trust. The story of Samson and Delilah is much more than a simple cautionary tale about the dangers of female seduction. It is a complex exploration of human nature, of the interplay between love and betrayal, strength and weakness, free will and destiny. It raises profound questions about the nature of trust, the corrupting influence of power, and the enduring search for connection and meaning in a world often marked by conflict and suffering. It is a story that continues to resonate with us today because it speaks to the fundamental struggles of the human condition, the battles we all face within ourselves and with the world around us. The long road to redemption. Samson's capture and imprisonment marked the lowest point in his tumultuous life. Blinded, humiliated, and stripped of his legendary strength, he was a living symbol of Philistine triumph and Israelite despair. The once mighty warrior, the prophesied deliverer, was now a broken man, forced to perform menial labor in the darkness of a Gaza prison. Each turn of the millstone, each jeer from his captors, was a fresh reminder of his fall, a constant echo of his betrayal by Delilah. But even in this abyss of despair, something unexpected began to happen. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Samson's hair, the symbol of his Nazirite vow and the source of his God-given strength, began to grow back. This seemingly insignificant detail, often overlooked in the broader narrative, is crucial to understanding Samson's journey towards redemption. It was not merely a physical regrowth, it was a sign, a symbol of a deeper, more profound transformation taking place within him. For it was in the darkness of that prison, in the depths of his suffering, that Samson began to truly grapple with the consequences of his choices. He had been a man driven by passion, by impulse, by a thirst for vengeance. He had allowed his desires to cloud his judgment, leading him down a path of destruction and ultimately to his own downfall. Now, stripped of everything, he was forced to confront the emptiness of his past victories, the hollowness of a life lived solely for the gratification of his own desires. This period of imprisonment was not simply a time of physical suffering. It was a crucible of spiritual and emotional transformation. It was in the silence of his cell, in the monotonous rhythm of the grinding mill, that Samson began to truly hear the voice of God, a voice that had perhaps been drowned out by the roar of battle and the clamor of his own passions. We can imagine Samson, during those long, dark hours, wrestling with his past, replaying his life's choices in his mind's eye. Did he finally understand the warnings of his parents, the dangers of his attraction to Philistine women? Did he see with painful clarity how his anger and his thirst for revenge had blinded him to the true meaning of his mission? Did he mourn the loss of his strength, or did he begin to realize that his true strength lay not in his physical prowess, but in his connection to God? Did he finally grasp that his Nazirite vow was not merely a set of external rules, but a symbol of an inner commitment, a dedication to a higher purpose? This period of introspection, of self-examination, was crucial for Samson's eventual redemption. It was a dark night of the soul, a period of intense suffering and doubt that ultimately led to a profound spiritual awakening. He began to understand that his strength had been a gift that he had squandered through his own pride and recklessness. He turned to prayer, not the prayers of a warrior seeking victory in battle, but the prayers of a broken man seeking forgiveness and a renewed connection with the divine. He prayed for understanding, for guidance, for the strength to endure his suffering, and perhaps for one last chance to fulfill his destiny. I find this part of Samson's story particularly inspiring. It shows that even when we are at our lowest point, even when we have made terrible mistakes and suffered devastating consequences, there is always an opportunity for redemption. Samson's time in prison was a period of immense suffering, but it was also a time of spiritual growth. It was a time for him to reconnect with his faith and to rediscover his true purpose. The Philistines, blinded by their own arrogance, underestimated Samson's capacity for renewal. They saw only a defeated man, a blind prisoner. They failed to recognize the inner strength that was growing within him, fueled by his renewed faith and determination. The growth of Samson's hair was a visible sign that God had not abandoned him. Each strand that grew back was a reminder of the Nazirite vow, a symbol of his renewed commitment to God. Samson knew that his strength was inextricably linked to his obedience and devotion. He began to pray fervently, asking for forgiveness and a new chance to fulfill his purpose. This spiritual renewal was what he needed to face the challenges that still lay ahead. Blindness and humiliation had transformed him, making him stronger in spirit and more determined to fulfill God's will. The Philistines, celebrating their victory over Samson, frequently held festivals and celebrations where they displayed the captured hero. They believed they had triumphed completely, that the threat of Samson had been neutralized forever. However, in their blindness, they failed to realize that they were fueling Samson's renewed determination and faith. Every insult and humiliation only strengthened his resolve. He knew that an opportunity would come, and he was determined to seize it. His faith in God was his true strength, and he was ready to use it when the right moment came. Samson's story in prison is a powerful example of redemption and resilience. It teaches us that even when we are at our lowest point, there is always a chance to rise again. Faith and determination can help us overcome the hardest adversities. Samson, with all his physical strength, discovered that his true strength lay in his faith and relationship with God. This lesson is something we can all apply in our own lives. No matter how great the challenges we face, there is always hope if we maintain our faith and determination. The final act. The climax of Samson's story is a scene of both devastating destruction and profound redemption. It is a moment that has been immortalized in art, literature, and popular culture, yet its true meaning often remains obscured by the sheer spectacle of the event. The Philistines, emboldened by their capture of Samson and confident in their dominance over the Israelites, gathered in the temple of their god Dagon for a great festival. Thousands of people, including the 5 rulers of the Philistines and a multitude of citizens, crowded into the massive structure, a testament to Philistine power and architectural prowess. They had come to celebrate their victory, to offer sacrifices to their god, and to revel in the humiliation of their once feared enemy. Samson, blind and weakened, but with his hair slowly growing back, was brought out from prison to be the centerpiece of their entertainment. He was to be a living trophy, a symbol of their complete and utter triumph over the Israelites and their God. They mocked him, jeered at him, and reveled in his suffering, oblivious to the transformation that had taken place within him during his imprisonment. As he was led into the temple, Samson, guided by the young servant who held his hand, made a seemingly simple request. He asked to be placed between the 2 central pillars that supported the massive structure. These pillars were not merely architectural features. They were symbolic representations of Philistine power, the very foundation upon which their dominance rested. "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple," he said, his voice filled with a newfound resolve, "so that I may lean on them." The servant, perhaps sensing something unusual in Samson's demeanor, complied with his request. And in that moment, standing between the pillars, Samson made his final, fateful decision. He reached deep within himself, not to the remnants of his physical strength, but to the wellspring of his renewed faith, and he prayed to the God of Israel one last time. "Sovereign Lord," he cried out, his voice echoing through the vast temple, "remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." This prayer is often misinterpreted as a mere cry for vengeance, a final act of unrelenting retribution for every wrong he had suffered by a defeated warrior. But to understand it as such is to miss the profound transformation that had taken place within Samson. This was not simply a prayer for personal retribution. It was a prayer for redemption, a plea to fulfill the divine purpose for which he had been chosen so many years before. He knew this would be his final act, a last sacrifice to fulfill his mission of freeing his people. In his blindness, in his humiliation, Samson had finally come to understand the true meaning of his Nazirite vow. It was not about physical strength, nor was it about personal glory. It was about dedication to God, about serving a purpose greater than himself, about liberating his people from oppression. And so, with his hands on the pillars, the very symbols of Philistine power, Samson, empowered not by his own might, but by the strength of his faith, pushed with all his might. The temple, filled with thousands of unsuspecting Philistines, began to tremble. The crowd, initially boisterous and celebratory, fell silent as they realized with a dawning horror what was happening. Then, in a moment of catastrophic destruction, the pillars gave way. The roof, unable to withstand the strain, collapsed, bearing the Philistine rulers, their people, and Samson himself beneath tons of stone and debris. In that single devastating act, Samson brought down the temple of Dagon, killing more Philistines in his death than he had in all his previous battles. This was Samson's final act, his ultimate sacrifice. He gave his life to deliver a decisive blow against the Philistine oppressors, fulfilling, in a way he could never have foreseen, the prophecy that had been foretold before his birth. His death was both a tragedy and a triumph, a testament to the destructive power of unchecked passions and the redemptive power of faith. The legacy of a flawed hero. The news of the temple's collapse and the death of the Philistine rulers spread like wildfire throughout the land. For the Israelites, it was a moment of both profound sorrow and renewed hope. They mourned the loss of their champion, the flawed but ultimately heroic figure who had dedicated his life to their liberation. But they also recognized the magnitude of his sacrifice, the significance of his final act. Samson's kinsmen went down to Gaza, retrieved his body from the rubble, and buried him in the tomb of his father, Manoah, between Zorah and Eshtal. It was a simple burial, a quiet end to a life that had been anything but quiet. But in that simple act, they honored not just the man, but the symbol he had become, a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of the enduring power of faith. Samson's story did not end with his death. It lived on, passed down through generations, becoming a cornerstone of Israelite identity, a source of both inspiration and cautionary wisdom. He was remembered as a judge who had led Israel for 20 years, a flawed but ultimately righteous leader who had delivered his people from their enemies. But Samson's legacy is far more complex than that of a simple hero or a straightforward morality tale. His story raises profound questions about the nature of strength, the dangers of unchecked passions, the complexities of love and betrayal, and the possibility of redemption, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable failures. He was a man of contradictions, a man of both immense strength and profound weakness. He was a deliverer and a destroyer, a lover and a fighter, a sinner and a saint. He was in many ways a reflection of the human condition itself, a reminder that we are all capable of both great good and terrible evil. His story challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question our assumptions about heroism and villainy, and to confront the darkness within ourselves. It compels us to ask the hard questions. What are our own Delilahs? What are the hidden forces, the internal or external pressures that threaten to bring us down? And how can we find the strength, not just in our muscles, but in our spirit, in our faith to overcome them? Samson's life is a powerful lesson about the importance of trusting in God, even when we don't understand his plan. It's a reminder that our true strength comes not from our physical abilities, but from our willingness to surrender to a higher purpose. And it's a testament to the enduring power of redemption, the possibility of finding forgiveness and renewal even after we've made terrible mistakes. But perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from Samson's story is the importance of self-awareness. Samson's downfall was not simply the result of Delilah's betrayal, it was the consequence of his own unchecked passions, his own pride, his own failure to truly understand his strengths and weaknesses. It is only through honest introspection, through a willingness to confront our own flaws and vulnerabilities, that we can hope to avoid the pitfalls that ensnared Samson. It is only by seeking guidance, whether from a higher power, from trusted mentors, or from within ourselves, that we can hope to navigate the complexities of life and fulfill our own unique potential. Samson's story continues to resonate with us today because it speaks to the fundamental struggles of the human condition. It reminds us that we are all capable of making mistakes, of falling prey to temptation, of losing our way. But it also offers us hope. It shows us that even in our darkest moments, redemption is possible. That even when we feel broken and defeated, we have the power to rise again, to find new meaning and purpose in our lives. So, I ask you now, what will you do with this newfound understanding of Samson? How will you apply these lessons to your own life? Will you allow yourself to be defined by your past mistakes, or will you choose to forge a new path, a path of strength, resilience, and redemption? If this exploration of Samson's untold story has resonated with you, if it sparks something within you, then I urge you to share this with others. Let's create a conversation that goes beyond the surface, that delves into the heart of what it means to be human. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, remember the lessons of Samson. Embrace your strength, confront your weaknesses, and never give up on the possibility of redemption. The power to change your story is within you. The story of Samson is ultimately a story about the power of choice. It's a reminder that we are not merely puppets of fate, but active participants in the unfolding drama of our own lives. We have the power to choose our path, to learn from our mistakes, and to strive towards a better version of ourselves. We have the power to choose redemption. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all.